Hi guys, welcome back to another Hugh Jeffreys video. In this video, I'm going to be attempting to restore this Huawei P20 Pro. I purchased this phone for only $70 as cracked and not powering on. They did state that the charge LED would light up, so I was hopeful that I could get it working. The phone has sustained massive impacts to the front display, which have been so hard as to leave outward bulges on the back housing, causing it to shatter. This will be my first Huawei repair, so I'm not sure what to expect in terms of how easily it can be repaired. To try and restore this, I'm going to need a replacement display, a new back panel, as well as a new battery. To get things started, I'm going to heat the back of the phone up on this heat plate here, setting it to around 120 degrees, although I found this not to be overly accurate. I'll need to remove any stickers or things that could burn whilst I'm applying some extra heat with this heat gun. I will also apply some tape to the back. I did this at first to see if I could apply a suction cup, although that didn't work. However, the tape will hold in place some of the glass shards as we're removing this back panel. It's unfortunate to see, like many modern phones, the back is strongly glued into place. This will make the removal relatively difficult. However, I'm used to seeing this, so I'll use my regular procedure. Once we've made a point of entry with the metal jimmy tool, I can use some plastic picks with some alcohol applied on them to help separate the adhesive. If your back panel isn't cracked, you could use a suction cup to help make the initial gap and therefore not risk scratching the frame of the phone. Given our device is really shattered, this makes the removal process even more difficult. So with the assistance of that jimmy tool, it should make it a little bit easier. Now with this Huawei P20 Pro, there's also a cable running under this back panel, which is attached to it, so we'll need to be careful when we lift up. Carefully peeling back, I was surprised to see that this cable is actually got a fair bit of length to it and allows you to open it up similar to a book. Disconnecting that cable, I can entirely remove the back panel. Next up, we can remove the several Phillips head screws securing in place the wireless charging coil. With those out of the way, I can use a spudger to lift that out of place. Next up, I can disconnect the battery and move down to the lower portion of the phone. There, I can remove more Phillips head screws, securing in the charging port and a piece of plastic. I'll also need to disconnect this interconnect cable and remove it from the phone. Taking a closer look at the battery, you can see a couple of bulges, which are the result of the impact of the screen. To assist with the battery removal, I placed the phone once again on that heat plate, although it didn't really help in softening the battery adhesive. So back out with the alcohol, I can apply lots of it and try and get it underneath the battery as best I can. Gone are the days of removing a battery with your finger. A lot of prying is needed with this phone, and how any company can get away with gluing all the major components down to make it near impossible to remove things without damaging them is truly shocking. It's not only Huawei doing this, there's heaps of companies like Samsung and Apple that do the exact same thing. I won't be reusing this battery, but why don't they just use a bracket or something to hold the battery into place? Looking at that mid-frame, you can see that there is still more dinting going on. I'm going to remove the SIM card tray, which still had a SIM card in it, although it isn't active. I'll also need to remove the LCD connections, the camera, and the two antenna wires. I'll then connect up our new display to not only test it out, but also the phone. Installing our new battery as well, I can connect everything up and test the phone. Pressing and holding the power button, we can see it sprung right back into life. It's locked with a passcode, although we can remove that later on. It's now time to remove our motherboard and get this front display assembly off. Replacing the display should be a relatively easy and manageable task. However, with a lot of phones, this isn't the case. As for this Huawei, it's the hardest I've ever came across. Between the display and metal frame is a plastic bezel which doesn't come with my new screen, so I'll need to remove the screen without damaging this 1mm thick piece of plastic. With my heat gun set at around 230 degrees, I was able to force my way in with a jimmy tool. This piece of plastic tended to lift up with the display, so I had to be really careful and slow with this procedure. Up at that notch, there's a few flex cables, so I found it easier just to rip half the display off, so I was able to navigate around those flex cables and components as not to damage them. The screen did shatter into many pieces, however, I wasn't damaging any of the cables underneath. Now the reason I've started at the top of the phone here is I want to avoid damaging the home button cable at the bottom. You can see I'm applying lots of heat as it's actually discoloring the screen. This adhesive is really strong and takes quite a bit of work to get separated. But with a bit of luck and lots of heat, I made my way down to the lower portion of the phone. There I could just heat up around the home button and carefully go around with a pick before we remove the entire display assembly. You can see it got pretty beaten up with the removal process. I believe if a component needs to be damaged in order to remove it, then it's made too difficult to replace. This is the sort of things companies shouldn't be able to do. Regardless, I'm going to clean up my workspace with a vacuum cleaner before we can remove any of the remaining shards of glass or adhesive left behind on the frame and that plastic bezel I was talking about earlier. As you can see, it's gotten pretty beaten up with the removal process of the display, and it seems to be unstuck in various areas. It is, however, still in one piece, so I'll be able to stick it back down into place. I would avoid using any sort of heat to help remove the glass after you've removed the display panel, as it just tends to warp and melt the plastic frame. After cleaning up the frame, it's time to get the home button off of that old screen panel. Now it is held in with one flex cable, so I'll need to disconnect that first before pressing it out of the screen. As with the rest of this phone so far, it is also proving quite difficult to remove. And with a lot of pressure and heat, it still wouldn't budge. In the end, I broke away the home button from the rest of the display panel so I could get a little bit more force and a little bit more room to work, and I got it out in one piece. That was too difficult for what it should be. Regardless, I connected it back up into place and our screen is ready to go. Coming back to the frame, I'm going to apply some new adhesive both for the plastic frame and the screen itself. Now originally the screen was held down with adhesive on that plastic frame. However, as you can see with the adhesive I'm applying here, it's just too large. The adhesive I am applying is only 2mm in thickness, so that should give you a bit of a perspective on just how thin that plastic piece really is. With the piece back installed, I'm going to apply some bigger adhesive around the sides to hold in the main display panel. This stuff is really thin and shouldn't cause any issues with the display. I can remove all the protective film and then we can get the display panel reinstalled. Carefully routing the cable through the mid-frame, I can press our new display panel into place. I could already see that our new display wasn't fitting perfectly, although it was now attached. I thought I'd also redo the thermal paste as it was quite crusty and it has been separated from the motherboard itself, so it's always a good idea to redo that whilst you're inside the phone. So applying some regular computer thermal paste, I can reinstall the motherboard back into position. From there, I can reconnect the two antenna wires, the new LCD, and throw in a battery so we can test out this Huawei P20 Pro. Pressing and holding that power button, thankfully we see the Huawei boot screen, although I immediately noticed that this was an LCD and not an OLED as original and as advertised with this replacement display. What's worse than that is that I've cracked the LCD when I've installed it onto the frame. So unfortunately, this is where we're going to have to stop the video. If you take a look at the screen, you can see that the LCD is clearly cracked and we're getting various lines and such in the screen. Now the touch panel is still working for the most part, and the phone itself is also working. So our phone is now functioning more than it did before, but it's still broken and still not fully functional. Now because I don't have a spare screen to throw on this, this is as far as I can take this phone. Now I have put it back together in that the screws are all reinstalled, but I haven't stuck the back panel on because there's no point doing that if the phone isn't fully functioning. Now because this phone also has someone's personal data on it, I'm going to run it through a factory reset, and that should be able to get us into an operating system where we can take more of a detailed look at the phone itself. Okay, it turns out I booted into safe mode, which means I didn't even have to set up the phone and we can already get into it, so that's pretty sweet. In the About section of the phone, we can see this is running Android 9, which means it's a pretty recent phone. and everything seems to be working just fine except that display panel. If you come across something like this where you've done a repair and it doesn't go to plan, at least put it back together, and that'll save you from having a whole bunch of screws in 6 months and you have no idea where they even go. Yes, I broke it pressing it into place, but still I was supposed to be sold an OLED display panel. Instead, I got an inferior LCD. Occasionally things go wrong, and that can't be avoided, especially when we can't get parts directly from the manufacturer, and sometimes things just rock up not being up to standard. But what we've learned is it's not worth replacing a display only. Get the whole frame and the screen already glued together, because you'll likely break something if you try and do it otherwise. Some manufacturers like Samsung, it's a little bit easier to do a screen only swap and not replace the entire frame. But for Huawei, especially this P20 Pro, get the whole assembly. The replacement display even has a much larger notch, although that actually was noted in the listing, but the fact that it was an LCD was not. However, I must say, the color of this device is quite beautiful. And on that note, this has been a Hugh Jeffreys video. If you like what you saw, hit that subscribe button and consider checking out the phone restoration playlist for some more successful repairs unlike this one. Also be sure to visit my website, link for which is down in the description. That's all for this video, and I'll catch you guys next time.